The muscle-bound lunatic in the thumbnail you just clicked is a member of the Shabah, or the ghost militia that used to operate under Assad, who just, of course, fled to Russia. And the unraveling of Syria is so interesting. Like so many other countries, it's turning out to be a big gangster dope conspiracy. So we'll get back to the Shabah militia, which means ghost. It's a slang for, there was a certain Mercedes C-Class back in the 80s that they nicknamed the Ghost. And these guys initially were gangsters out of the city of Latakia. And slang for them was they were named after these Mercedes because they were involved in smuggling. But also, I had been wanting to do a story about the Capta-gon trade in the Middle East coming out of Syria. And now that Syria's, well, Assad has fled and people are able to go through the country, it's clear that the volume of the Capta-gon trade exceeded even what people thought. Now, what is Capta-gon? Well, it's a pill that's sold. It has two crescents, or it says Lexus on it. It's technically a counterfeit version of a real medication, sort of like an early version of Adderall prescribed for narcolepsy and stuff like that. But it was found to be addictive, and, well, a lot of stuff's addictive. But for whatever reason, I guess Adderall and Ritalin were better. But it continued to be made in the Middle East, and because it was medication in a culture that is very anti, well, at least on the surface, anti the use of drugs, having something that at least is masquerading as a medication. So Capta-gon's the most, well, heroin is the most popular drug in the Middle East, and Capta-gon's second. So Capta-gon tablets have been being manufactured in Syria by Assad's government. His brother-in-law was probably in charge of the whole thing. For years, they've been seizing, let's see, I think in the last couple years before what just happened, there was a seizure in Italy of 86 million Capta-gon pills, and there was a seizure in Dubai, maybe, also, of 86 million. So in a place like Syria, where the average monthly income is $200, Capta-gon pills, where they're being made, go for $1. But like in they call it a club drug, like say in Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest market for it. And I didn't realize how big Saudi Arabia has, like 70 million people. They can go for $20, $25 each. So let's just say, I mean, 86 million pills, let's just say you're even getting $5 for them wholesale. Say you're getting $3 for them wholesale. That's $250 million seizures. So Assad's regime, I think last year they estimated $9 billion worth of Capta-gon made and exported. Well, that's larger than Syria's whole economy. Of course, Assad destroyed Syria's economy starting with the civil war 13 years ago. Assad and his family history are fascinating. It's going to bring me back to the guy in the thumbnail. I haven't forgotten about that. So Assad's grandfather was a village strongman back in the 20s. He became powerful in his area. He changed the family's last name from maybe Soleimani to Assad, which means Al-Assad, the lion. So I guess bravery, or tough, brave. And Bashar Assad, the guy who just fled, his father, Hafiz al-Assad, he took power in Syria in 1970, military coup. He ruled till 2000. When he died, his son, the one who just fled, took over. Now, Bashar, who just fled, was not supposed to be the inheritor of Syria from his dad. There was another brother who was groomed, who was more of a tough guy, playboy. He died in a car wreck. He was driving around, speeding in a sports car in the mid-90s maybe. And so then Bashar was brought back from London, where he had been trained to be an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor. And there was a lot of grumblings that he was not going to be tough enough, so that's why some people think maybe that's why he became so brutal, was to make sure people didn't think he was weak. He overcompensated. So the Assad, his father was, of course, a member of the Ba'ath Party. Saddam Hussein was also a Ba'athist, but the Ba'ath Party, which was initially, you can almost think of it like, well, somewhat of an Arab fascism. So it's a pan-Arabist, that Arabs should be united across countries. But of course, what's an Arab? All Arabs aren't Muslim. And then you have the Sunni-Shia rift. So Ba'athists tend to not emphasize religion. They're not anti-Islam, but they're more secular. They're generally anti-Wahhabist. Wahhabism is the religion of Saudi Arabia. So 2000, Bashar al-Assad takes power and his father dies. In 2011, if you remember the Arab Spring, when multiple countries in, let's see, like Tunisia, Gaddafi fell, Tunisia changed power, Morocco, Egypt, there was a bunch of change in the Middle East. And Bashar al-Assad was not going to let that happen in Syria. He had inherited an extremely strong and restrictive and brutally deadly military from and secret police from his father. And he was also a member of, well, the Assad family are Alawites. And Alawites, they'll say, is a branch of Islam, but it's a very old, it's very secretive. It's small. There's a couple million Alawites in Syria and maybe another few 100,000 in Turkey. There's less than 5 million, I think, globally. Very secretive. From what I've learned, or I could read about it, so much of its beliefs are different from traditional Islam that I think that a lot of Muslims probably don't. Certainly the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia would not even consider them to be Muslims. They would consider them to be pagans, probably. They believe in a certain type of reincarnation, that the life force can move out of one person into another, into inanimate objects. So, now, I don't necessarily think Bashar al-Assad believes that, but they're also an ethnic group. So anyways, the Alawites, who had been holding power under the Assads, and the Assad family always was preferential to other Alawites. That's who was prominent in the economy, even though they were less than 10% of the Syrian population. And so when the Arab Spring started, he knew that if he fell, it was likely that he would end up like Gaddafi, drug in the street and brutalized, because his father and himself in decades had been brutalizing people, and the Alawites, considered by some, probably other Muslims, to be not even Muslim. So he made the decision to not let any hint of uprising happen. And the way that the Syrian civil war started, and it shows you very dark in how he was, on a garage, might have been in Latakia, whatever city it was in. Some kids wrote, "You're next, doctor." So the disparaging nickname, or just a nickname for Assad, was the doctor, because he'd been a doctor of ophthalmology before he came back to run Syria. "You're next, doctor." So just a graffiti some kids wrote on a garage. The troops show up. Well, getting back to the guy in the thumbnail, the Shahab, the ghost, these militia that were not actual members of the Syrian military, so they could say, well, the government didn't do it, but they would be paid supposedly $200 a day. you see the guy in that picture, that some of them were crazy steroid abusers. Like, there's no way that guy in that picture is alive now. That picture's from 2012. Crazy steroid abusers. A medical doctor had to treat one, was quoted as saying, I had to speak to them like children because the Shahab likes to recruit big dumb guys and give them steroids and guns, right? And Capta-gon, these meth pills, they get you hyped up. So, these kids write their graffiti on the wall. Assad sends in some of these with Shahab. They grab kids, 13-year-olds. A 13-year-old ends up with his you-know-what cut off, beaten, dumped on the street, right? So that's how he deals with rumblings of an Arab Spring in his country, TOTURE's children. And the Shahab was part of that. They were firing on peaceful demonstrators. They went into one town and they grabbed 8 and 9-year-olds. So they were in like a bus. They can't, maybe say 30 of them come in some kind of military bus. They grabbed a bunch of 8 and 9-year-olds and stuck them like in the wind, like on the front windshield. Like, think of like a scene from the Mad Max Fury Road where you have someone tied to the windshield of your bus and you're driving around. So if you shoot at us, you're going to shoot 8-year-olds. So steroided up, Capta-gon pilled up. They got, as you see in the thumbnail, that guy has Assad's face tattooed on him. And these people are in your town and they're grabbing your 8-year-old and tying them to the windshield of your car. So this is how the Syrian civil war started and why it's so bitter. A lot of the immigrant crisis in Europe was really pushed by what happened in Syria. It was a very big disaster. There's 1 million Syrians had been moving to Germany for years to work in the factories, which was all fine. But like, there's 1 million Syrians came just since 2012. So how do you incorporate 1 million refugees into a country without being problems? Well, it's difficult. So the Syrians, specifically, there were so many that different countries allowed to be in, which some people liked and some people didn't, and that's a separate issue. But the crisis of the Syrian civil war, there's like, in a country of maybe 30, 40 million, or less than that maybe, I think like maybe 1/3 of the population became internally displaced persons. There's several million refugees left the country, pushing European so what happened in Syria affected politics in Germany. Probably was a little bit of the what was behind the Brexit vote. So a very important geopolitical event. Assad, this caused the economy to collapse by 90%, and then he replaces it with the Capta-gon trade. In fact, him and his family, like his cousin, was a multi-billionaire who he fell out with and took some of his money a few years ago. It sounds like the 2 only real big money-making businesses in Syria at the end were the Capta-gon pills, which are supposed to be like Adderall. I would imagine if they're making them illegally, they're probably more like meth pills at this point. But it's hard to get research from over there. Though I had heard somebody was selling them on the, like, they're around in LA, here they were. I didn't take one, but they're around. I heard of them being around. So I don't know if they're like an Adderall or they're like something else. I don't know. But big business. So Capta-gon pills and Syria Tel, the minutes off of cell phone. So, and that was owned by Assad's cousin. So a country already, I think sometimes some of the stuff that's going on now in the world, it feels like maybe civilization already did fall and we're already living in the early aftermath, but we have all these gadgets and we're all high on something, whether it's just you're high off, dopamine hits off scrolling on your social media or going shopping, or food makes you high, eating a bunch of carbohydrates makes you high, being on antidepressants blah, blah, blah. You know the drill. So anyways, but Syria sounds really post-apocalyptic, where meth pills and cell phone minutes, you know, and I guess, well, gasoline would have been very important. But Syria produces oil, which brings us to Russia. So Russia came in and traded military help in exchange for Syria giving them some of their oil wells. And why Russia was such a backer of Syria, Syria is in between. So Syria's on the way, obviously, to Africa. Russia has a lot going on in Africa. So just like they went in and helped Assad with military in exchange for access to natural resources, of course, they have that going on in multiple countries in Africa, but it's hard to fly from Moscow or from wherever, central Russia, straight to, say, the Congo. You need to stop. So there's a key air base on the Mediterranean, which is where the Alawites and these ghost gangsters, Latiki, are from, that was very important for Russia for their exploitation of natural resources in Africa. So Putin had been backing Assad no matter what for all these years, and it was Putin's removal of military report that led to the government collapsing just like that. So what led Putin to suddenly remove support? I mean, is he running low on resources because of Ukraine? Probably so. This must be a sign that the Russian economy, which had been weathering the international sanctions well, but as of late, they have rampant inflation. They're starting to have economic problems. And must be running low on resources because Syria is a very important strategic partner. And then, of course, Iran also helps Syria, and Iran would help Hezbollah, which would help Syria. But Hezbollah has been decimated by Israel. So Syria's, well, Assad regime's two primary backers are having their military resources drained, and apparently had to, because there really wasn't much of a fight, because the forces under Assad, like they said, Assad's formal military, not the gangster ghost thugs he hired that would do the special dirty work, but the regular soldiers were wearing gym shoes, making $200 a month. When I say they're wearing gym shoes, it means they're not even getting uniforms. There's no money for uniforms. They're just guys with a military badge. Whereas the HTS fighters and other rebels, they're getting $100 a day to fight. They have on real military uniforms. They're getting weapons from Saudi Arabia, from the U.S. isn't giving them weapons, but where weapons are flowing through to them through other places. And but very complex. The United States was glad Russia was propping up Assad, and we probably sort of helped Assad at one point because Assad had to fight off ISIS or IS, the Islamic State, the Islamic Caliphate, that real crazy, brutal group of people. But Assad's regime might not have been much less brutal. But so that was just off the top of my head to give you some background on this very interesting unraveling of geopolitics there in Syria. It was an important ally for Russia. They abandoned it. So as soon as there weren't going to be Russian airstrikes, all the different anti-government forces knew they could just roll in. There's all sorts of footage of Syrian military there's like drone footage of them just taking their uniforms off and throwing them on the ground, throwing their gun away, changing their regular clothes and scattering and just blending into the population when they knew that the various anti-government forces were coming. Assad and his family supposedly are in Moscow. There's been no visual confirmation. In the last several years, Assad's family bought, I think, 18 different luxury condos in Moscow. And Moscow is one of the world's most expensive cities, if you didn't know. So Assad's family are billionaires, like him and his wife personally, and then he has a cousin and some other family members. So between him and all of his family, they probably have $10 billion scattered around, and a lot of it is from him being a much bigger dope dealer than, you know, El Mencho don't have $10 billion or $5 billion, I bet. I mean, maybe. But he can't access it as easily as Assad. I mean, so the Capta-gon trade, which in learning about what's going on over there, really realize how the Middle East is a big part of the world, depending on how you measure it, the Arabic speaking or the Muslim world. You know, like a billion people, but even the Middle East is like 430 million. From North Africa into Syria, Iraq, over to Afghanistan, it's like 430 million people. Saudi Arabia, it's a lot of damn people. And it's a place where you don't really see much about in the West, other than what would you think about it? Everyone is just very religious and Muslim. I mean, everyone's not even Muslim. There's Shia and Sunni are at each other's throats. Wahhabis don't like either, and that's Saudi Arabia. And there's a lot of drug use and gangsterism like anywhere. In Basra, the southern, like the second biggest city in Iraq, SWAT teams fan out every night to raid crystal meth spots. So and I think 2/3 of all the crystal meth seized in the world is in the Middle East. We don't see movies and TV shows, you don't hear about that. And then, of course, Iran alone consumes 5% of all the world's H. And I think between Afghanistan, the 3 countries with the highest addiction rates for H in the world are, by far, it's Iran, number 1. Then you got Afghanistan. Pakistan's very high. Iraq is high. Well, I mean, that's the part of the world that stuff comes from. And opiates ease the pain. That's a part of the world with, people aren't eating enough. They're at war. Psychological pain, physical pain, and stimulants, meth type stuff. You can work, or you need to drive. You're a truck driver, you got to drive 12 hours. You're a cab driver, you got to work. You got to move boxes for 20 hours, and there's not enough food. So I don't even know if this stuff can be considered recreational when you see the living conditions of a lot of people over in certain countries. You say, yeah, gee, I can see why you're doing a hard drug. You're not necessarily trying to get high, you're just trying to feel not so bad. So, if you didn't know, now you know. Syria, a global center of the meth trade. The Shabiha militia, the ghost gangsters, helped Assad keep himself in power for the 13 years of the Civil War, but eventually that wasn't even enough, and those grew out of gangsters in Latakia, the home of the Alawite sect, of which he and his family are members, named after a Mercedes-Benz used for smuggling. Isn't history and sociology so interesting, all the different connections? Al Prophet, Hu Akbar, American dope.